Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of creating a cute dinosaur monster type thing, where I'm going through the workflow of creating a character for a client. In the first episode I went through sketching out thumbnails, and this is the particular one that Andy, my client, liked. So in this episode I'll be improving this, going to kind of a second level of detail, passing it back to Andy for checking, and then going to a final level of detail where I'll go into things like scales or minor textures on the surface of the object. Okay, so this is always a tricky bit, I find, where you have to jump in to the next level of detail, and it can be a bit daunting. The best thing to do is just get straight in and start doing stuff. Of course, have your reference images at hand. I've only got a few, but I've got enough to be going on. The first thing I am going to do though is change the position. This doesn't need to be animated. If it was, I'd have to keep him in a T-pose, but I can push his position around a bit more into a comfortable seated position. Holding a controller is what we want. So I'm going to duplicate this again and pull it across to the side. It's just nice to have the initial starting point to know where I'm going and what I've changed. And in some ways, a point to go back to if it all messes up. So into sculpt mode, and with my snake hook tool, making sure Dine Topo is on. I'll keep the same resolution, and I'm just going to pull it around into a seated position. Still got symmetry turned on as well. I was thinking of having the feet pointing upwards, but actually I think it might be better if they're just sort of tucked under, like he's dog's hind legs sort of sit on the floor like that. I think that'd be better. So the base of him fairly even, these pushed out to the side. I'm using that technique of tapping, so just tap 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 to bring these areas out. I find that the easiest technique with the snake hook tool. So although I've not turned my resolution up, I am going a bit more detailed, changing the brush size down a bit more than it usually is, just to work on those minor elements. But again, it's really important not to up the detail if you don't need to. You just end up with more vertices than you need, and it becomes more complicated and awkward to push them around. That's why it's nice to have the starting point there as well. You can sort of see, oh yes, that's looking better, or not sometimes. I'm still experimenting and thinking exactly how I want things. So how are the arms going to stick out the body? What's really looking cute in a way? What I find really important as well is to get to side view as well. The shape just isn't working. It's really sort of static in a sense, and it's got no curve to it. So I really need to sort that out now. And that's a common error of beginners, is not going to side view enough, and they end up with a very sort of flat image. It's hard to really describe the effect that has until you see it for yourself, but it looks fine from the front, but then you go to the side and it's got no structure. so there's much more of a curve there, which is quite nice. And get that basic shape before you do anything else is absolutely vital. I'm just trying a few things out with the face, because this is only a very rough idea. But the roundness to this is quite nice, and that tends to make things look more cute, is sort of roundness. But you could maybe have some sort of goofy type of teeth in here as well. Can you see why it's nice to have that initial shape, so I can see what changes I've made, what differences it's making, and that will inform my decisions. I find it really helpful anyway. And can you see how flat that one looks, and now this has got a nice curve. It's quite important to get to side view. But in terms of the front, there's not an awful lot of difference, perhaps a touch in the face. So the character will have a controller, and maybe it's a good idea to get the size of that controller now and think what that's going to look like. We can also roughly position him, although we'll want the character in an asymmetrical position eventually. So we can't position him completely, but we can get just a rough idea. So it's important to get your objects, if you have any objects that are related to your character or they're going to interact with, and get them in early so that you can see the sizes. And so in this case his arms are very short, so I've got to really consider the size of this controller for one, but also whether he can reach it with his arms. I'd like the controller to be quite big, because then it makes him look more cute and cuddly, because it makes him seem quite small in comparison to the controller. So I think that's fine. I'm going to rig the character really slightly just to give him, just to give the arms a bit of positioning. So I'm going Shift A to add a armature, single bone, and in 2.8 we need to go to the display options in the armature tab just here, or the object data tab, sorry, under display, and then in front is the new sort of X-ray mode. So I'll just start moving that around in edit mode. So just really basic, just so it's easier to move. I could obviously do this with the snake hook tool, but it's actually quite awkward to keep the shape and get it in the right position, and it will just be easier with an armature. So I'm just going to give his hand one bone, and I'm sure that will work. And I'm just going to put a bone down here. It seems strange, but that will attach all this stuff and make sure it doesn't attach to the arm. And I'll put one up there as well. I only need to symmetrize one side because I'll just mirror it across the other in Dine Topo. So lastly, I'll come out of edit mode, select my object, select the bones with Shift, and Control P to parent with automatic weights. So now I should be able to select my bones, go into pose mode, and move them around. Basic rotations should be fine, and they're all weighted fine as well, so that's good. And I think he'll look more comfortable if the controller's a little bit lower down. And I can see that his stomach is actually just too big for the controller, so I'm going to need to do some adaptations around there. So somewhere around there looks fine. I'll then go back into object mode, select my character and apply the armature. Now what I've found, it is useful to get rid of the object data as well. The object has this sort of vertex group with bones, and I find it simpler just to remove all those. So on the right hand side here, delete all groups. That way when I go back to Dine Topo, it won't affect it. I'm going to delete these bones now. I suppose actually I'll just hide them, just in case I need them again. So now I can click on my object to go back to sculpt mode, into Dine Topo, and with the remesh I can symmetrize from the positive X to the negative X. And now he's holding the controller. Looks like he's holding a set of drums at the moment. So a bit of adaptation to do, but we're slowly getting there. So there we go, I'm still on a low detail, just adapting the shape, and it's coming out okay. There's really no need to go to any higher detail than this, because it will just confuse your mesh and make it more difficult to sculpt and pull around, especially when you're trying to do big movements, like I was there in a sense. I would say they're relatively big movements of the fingers anyway. If that was a detailed mesh, they'd be blobbing all over the place. So a nice simple mesh like this makes it easy to sculpt. So I think it's about time that I did up the detail level and start doing some more features around the face and around the feet, and maybe even in the fingers with the claws. So I'm not going up much, I'm going to 15 and just see how that feels and looks. Around these sort of areas it's quite tough, and it's where they're close to each other because you almost want them touching. So the inflate tool is a better option than the draw tool, is then it sort of pushes them together. But I'm still aware that having overlapping geometry is not good, so I'm trying to avoid that where possible. And if I don't need to see it, then I'll just sort of join it together like I am at the moment. I draw with it and then smooth it out. Generally I'm trying to keep the time lapse so it's not too quick. This is speeded up to 600%, but most of the time I'm going to 350. So not too quick, so you can still follow along with what I'm doing. My Sculpt January stuff I sometimes went up to 2000% just to fit it all in. But hopefully you're able to glean what I'm doing from this and get the idea. Also, I've probably mentioned before, but I'm using a Wacom Mobile Studio Pro. So that's a tablet with a screen. So it's like a Cintique, but it's mobile, so you can move it around. It's its own computer. But you can plug it in and use it just like a Cintique as well. I do find it a bit more helpful when I can see exactly what I'm drawing. So rather than looking up at the screen with my hand down on a graphics tablet, I can look at the screen and draw onto the screen. It is just a slightly quicker workflow, slightly easier, but it's probably not, if you're really serious about art, then yes, I think it's well worth getting a screen that you can draw on. And some of the Huions and UGs are pretty good these days. Tough to get them to work with the drivers sometimes, and you have to be kind of prepared for that, a bit of fiddling about with that sort of thing. But if you've got the money to spend, then a Cintique is still the industry's the one that people want. So I would go for that. However, a graphics tablet is certainly a must. It's so hard to do these things with a mouse. I do hear of people every now and again saying that they're doing it with a mouse, but it's so much easier with a graphics tablet. Even if you're feeling like it's taking a while to get used to, or you don't feel like you can get used to them, you will eventually. It takes maybe just a couple of hours of work, and you'll just suddenly have the hand-eye coordination. It will all work. I have got links in the description for lots of different graphics tablets, and you'll be supporting me if you click on those links and buy a graphics tablet from those places. But I would suggest shopping around because they do tend to vary a lot from place to place. GearBest seems really good in terms of price. I don't know so much about customer service. I've never tried to send anything back there, but they've always been pretty good with me. But they know that I'm a YouTuber, and if I say something bad, then it will really affect them. So I can't really vouch for what their customer service is really like, but I do know their prices are really good. And I have got a video where you can see my ultimate guide to graphics tablets, where I go through all my recommendations. At the moment, I think the Veikk A50, I think it is the best, and the Huion, the one with the Tilt Sport H10 610 Pro. But again, the Cintiques, sorry, not the Cintique, the Wacom, the drivers seem to work really well for them, generally speaking, and the other brands, which are generally a lot cheaper, you have to do a bit of fiddling around with the drivers quite often, and it may not even work on your system, and you'll have to send it back, which can be a frustration. Anyway, back to the sculpt. You can see that I've been working on the teeth. They're just separate objects, a subdivided cube, and sort of stretched it a bit and moved it into position, and then I sculpt around that object. It's nice to have it as a separate object when it's something like a tooth. I've just worked on one side and then I've scaled them across to the other side, but I've already rotated this one so it looks a little bit peculiar. I put the object origin in the center because the whole thing is in the center, so that's fine, and then they should just flip across the other side with a duplicate and then a scale x-1, but obviously the rotation on this one was slightly off, so I can just rotate that around the Y, and then that should be sorted out. I'm still not happy with the pose, but I feel like I need to work on the model just a touch more, maybe get some claws on the feet and sort the feet out just a touch, and the tail a bit, before I actually start posing it a bit more and putting it in position. It's always really tricky to think about when to go off symmetry. So at the moment it's nice and easy because anything I do to one side will be repeated on the other, and therefore I only need to do half the work. But when it comes to the detailed aspects, maybe some sort of spots around here and scales, that sort of thing, it's sometimes best to be off symmetry anyway, because you get this sort of line down the middle. It's not a particularly detailed model either, so I can probably get away with going into that pose fairly early at this point. The problem you have, if you add too much detail, then you pose it, some of those details will be skewed and pulled around, which may not be the look you're looking for. And also, if it's really high poly, you can't add an armature very easily, and it's very laggy when you're trying to pull it around. The best way to combat this sort of thing, the best way to approach this sort of thing is to add as much of the silhouette detail as you can. So I'm going to do the claws in a second, and just sort the eyes out the touch as well, and maybe think a bit more about the tail, with a bit of smartening up around the hands as well. Once you've got that silhouette detail and you're not going to change the structure of your model anymore, then you can retopologize, and you can take it out to a simple program like Instant Mesh and bring it back in with a shrink wrap, and at that point we can go to the multi-resolution modifier to add our detail, and we can apply an armature to a multi-resolution modifier, and it's much easier because it applies it to the base shape. Then we can pose our model and add details really easily. So I'll just tidy up a little bit and get that final silhouette. I'm going to up the detail really slightly to 20 for those sort of more detailed areas around the hands, a bit around the eyes and around the feet. You can always bring this back down again. So I'm just inflating the areas around the claws and then denting in with the crease brush to define the shape. At the moment I'm not too worried whether it's grabbing the control or not. I'm going to pose that a bit later on with a new armature. I'm going to have to watch out here though, because my armature might stick to this part, so I've got to be a bit careful when I add it. So now I'm using a mask. I can paint on a mask with black with this option here. And any black parts will not be affected by the next brush that I use. You can hold down Control to clear the mask, so unpaint. And I want to be able to separate the distance between the two a little bit more. You can see there's a slight blob there that I want to get rid of. So now when I go to, let's say, the snake hook tool and pull in, I'm still grabbing a bit of that mask actually, so I need to paint a bit more of that in. Now when I come to smooth this out, it's doing a better job, I think. I'm going to deflate with control, smooth it out. There we go, we've got a bit more distance now. Now I've got the resolution a bit high for this, and you can probably see it's going to be a bit blobby. Can you see that sort of blobbiness there? So there's no need to have that resolution that high. So I can get my simplify brush and paint, not there though, paint there and bring that back down to 10. Now when I smooth this area out, to clear the mask, you press Alt-M and that clears it. So let's go back to the hands, put my detail back up and start moving those around. So I've upped the resolution in the hands, and I've just got to think about how the thumb's going to be positioned, and the claw, or the thumbnail, but the claw in this case, is going to be positioned as well. I'm pressing the full stop key every now and again, so that you can zoom in on a specific area. That's the period key for anybody that's American. We call it full stop in Britain. I feel like I need to go up a bit more with the resolution actually. This is a much smaller area, but it does need the detail. I don't have to go too far because I am just trying to define the shape. I'll go a bit more detailed with the multi-resolution modifier when I add that a bit later on. Okay, so that's the hands, claws, I should say, and feet to a reasonable level. I don't need to go beyond this because it's going to be retopologized, but I do need the base shape intact. I'm going to put some spheres in here because I think they'll be able to textured. It'll be much easier to texture. So I'll put some dents in for some spheres. Then I'll put the object origin at the center, so Shift S to cursor to world origin, and then I will set the origin. Under object, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Now I can mirror this, and it'll be in exactly the right place the other side. All going well. And then I can start sculpting around those eyes. Put the resolution up just a touch more around the eyes. It's a really crucial spot, and that's where you want lots of detail. Eyes, face, and hands quite often. Interestingly, the symmetry seems really slightly off here. I'm going to resymmetrize the object. I'll save my work before I do that though. Yes, interestingly it's still not quite working. I'll work on one side and I'll just move the eye on the other side if it's a big problem. So I'll just do a bit more tidying up with a bit more detail around the teeth. Obviously changed my curve earlier, so it was a bit pointy. So the curve down here is quite useful for getting sharp lines, which I obviously changed at some point, but I need sort of curvier lines in this place. Yes, he's slowly getting better. He's looking quite happy. Still looking fairly cute-ish. The eyes need a bit of work, I think. And the tail needs just a touch of work as well. So at the moment he looks like he's frowning, so I'm just going to give a bit more detail there. I'll go back down to 30 though, because I'm just changing the shape. So the eyes going upwards is sort of like a happy expression, but if they're pointed down they'd be frowning, and that would be sort of angry. There we go. I'm looking at the right eye mainly. This should be in the same place. I've done something wrong there, but I can't figure it out at the moment why that's not in the correct place. No, try resetting the origin. Should be right in the center. And this origin is right in the center as well. So it doesn't move between the two objects. Why on earth is there a gap? Who knows? Okay, so let's figure out the tail. Let's just see where he's sitting. Got to be a bit careful that it doesn't go into the ground, so let's lift that up. I think I'll go down to 25 for this because it doesn't need to be that detailed. 25 is a bit high actually, 20 is going to be better. In fact, I'm going to go down even further because it's a base shape and it's difficult if it's too high a resolution. Now just up it slightly as I get towards the end. It's a very boring tail, but I think if it sort of curves around, it'd be kind of fun. I don't want it to be too long as well, because it looks more cute if it's short, in my opinion anyway. Trying to make it relatively flat, not flat, but against the ground. I suppose it is flat really, so that when I add the bones I'll have more control. Just going to do one last remesh, so I'll save it and symmetrize. See if that sorted out the eyes. It still doesn't. I don't understand what's going on with those eyes. Why is that happening? I'm sure I've done something wrong and someone can tell me what that is. Okay, so that's a good position now, ready for taking out into instant mesh, retopologizing, and then adding the multi-resolution modifier. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's quite a long one, but I kept it long because I felt like there were lots of good tips in here that would benefit people. So if you're still with me, well done, and I will see you next time. Hope this helps.